The sack held more than scraps. It held the weight of a child's sacrifice. Samuel's weathered hands trembled as he read the note tucked between moldy bread crusts. "We ate dirt so she could sleep." The Kansas wind carried dust across his boots, but nothing could carry away the silence that followed. 8-year-old Emily watched from the porch of the abandoned ranch, her hollow eyes holding secrets too heavy for her small frame. The cowboy, who had buried his own daughter 3 winters ago, now faced another child's desperate hunger. His silence wasn't indifference. It was the sound of a heart breaking twice. Samuel's horse stood motionless beneath the merciless Kansas sun, its breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. The abandoned ranch stretched before them like a graveyard of dreams, its broken fence posts reaching toward heaven like the fingers of buried men. He had come here following rumors of rustlers, but what he found was something far more devastating than stolen cattle. The silence of this place pressed against his chest like a stone, reminding him of another silence, the one that had filled his own home after the fever took his daughter 3 winters past. The sack lay crumpled near the well, its burlap fabric stained with mud and something darker. Samuel dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling a lonely song against the hard-pan earth. Each step toward that discarded bundle felt like walking toward his own grave, though he couldn't yet understand why. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, the metallic smell of desperation that clung to places where hope had died. His shadow fell across the sack like a dark blessing, and for a moment he hesitated. Inside the sack, moldy bread crusts nestled against apple cores, brown with age. But it was the piece of paper, carefully folded and tucked between the scraps, that made his hands shake. The writing was childish, uneven, spelled with the phonetic honesty of someone who had learned letters from whispered prayers rather than schoolbooks. "We ate dirt so she could sleep. The dirt tastes like pennies, but it fills the empty. Sarah don't know. I told her it was special bread." Samuel read the words 3 times before their meaning carved itself into his understanding. The note continued in that same heartbreaking script. "If someone finds this, Sarah is sleeping in the big house. She's little and don't eat much. I ate the dirt so she could have the real food. Ma said angels watch over little ones, but I think the angels got lost." Samuel's throat constricted as if he too had swallowed earth. The paper trembled in his weathered hands, and he found himself looking toward the ranch house with new eyes. Somewhere in that skeleton of a building, a child was sleeping, unaware that her sister had been eating soil to keep her fed. He folded the note carefully, as if it were made of butterfly wings rather than paper. The sack fell from his other hand, spilling its meager contents onto the ground. Bread crusts scattered like fallen leaves, and Samuel stared at them with the expression of a man watching his own past unfold. He remembered his daughter's last meal, how she had pushed the bowl away, too weak to eat, while he had begged her to take just one more spoonful. The memory and the present moment collided in his chest, like 2 trains meeting on the same track. The silence that followed was not empty but full of understanding, full of shared pain, full of the terrible mathematics of survival that children should never have to learn. Samuel stood there in the Kansas dust, a man who had thought his heart was already broken beyond repair, discovering that hearts could always break a little more. The wind died completely, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what a broken cowboy would do when faced with another broken child. The ranch house door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream, its hinges long since surrendered to rust and neglect. Samuel approached with the careful steps of a man entering a church, his boots whispering against the warped floorboards of the porch. Through the doorway, shadows pooled like spilled ink, and somewhere in that darkness, a child was sleeping. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat he had hoped never to wear again. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sweet, sour smell of abandonment. Broken furniture lay scattered like the bones of some great beast, and wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, melancholy strips. But there, in the corner where a shaft of sunlight fell through a cracked window, lay a small figure curled beneath a tattered quilt. Sarah, for this had to be Sarah, slept with the profound stillness of exhaustion, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too fragile for this harsh world. Her face was pale as moonlight, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she were whispering secrets to her dreams. Samuel removed his hat and held it against his chest, a gesture of reverence he hadn't made since standing beside his own daughter's grave. The child's hair was the color of wheat before harvest, spread across a pillow that had seen better decades. One small hand clutched the edge of the quilt, and Samuel could see the delicate bones beneath skin that seemed almost translucent. She was perhaps 8 years old, though hunger had a way of stealing years from children, making them seem both ancient and impossibly young at the same time. He knelt beside her sleeping form, his knees protesting against the hard floor. This close, he could see the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the way her clothes hung loose on her small frame. But there was something else. A peacefulness in her sleep that spoke of a child who had been protected, who had been loved enough that someone else had eaten dirt to keep her fed. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy and indigestible. Somewhere another child, Emily the note writer, the dirt eater, was carrying a burden no child should bear. The sound of footsteps on the porch made Samuel's hand move instinctively toward his gun, but he stopped when he saw her. Emily stood in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, her dress hanging in tatters, her feet bare and dirty. She was older than Sarah, but not by much, and her eyes held the terrible wisdom of someone who had been forced to become an adult before her time. She looked at Samuel with neither fear nor hope, but with the flat acceptance of someone who had learned that strangers usually brought more sorrow than salvation. "She's sleeping," Emily whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind through broken glass. "I told her angels were singing her to sleep, but I think it's just the wind in the walls." She stepped into the room with the careful movements of someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had no room for her. Samuel looked at this child who had written about eating dirt, who had sacrificed her own hunger for her sister's peace, and felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking this time, but opening like a door that had been locked too long. Samuel's calloused fingers traced the edge of the sack as Emily slept fitfully on the makeshift bed he'd arranged from horse blankets. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and even in sleep her small fists remained clenched as if still holding on to something precious. The moonlight streaming through the broken window cast silver shadows across her dirt-stained face, and Samuel found himself studying every line of exhaustion etched there. This child had written about eating dirt with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather, and that casual acceptance of suffering cut deeper than any blade ever could. He had seen men die on battlefields with less dignity than this 8-year-old had shown in her simple confession. The silence of the abandoned ranch house seemed to echo with all the words she hadn't written. The fear, the loneliness, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere might understand. The sack lay open beside him, its contents spread across the rough wooden table like evidence of a crime no court would ever judge. Crumbs of stale bread, a withered apple core, 3 beans that had somehow escaped being eaten. These were the treasures Emily had gathered while her sister lay dying. Samuel's throat tightened as he imagined this child crawling through dust and debris, collecting scraps with the same careful attention other children might give to picking wildflowers. She had rationed love the way others rationed water in the desert, giving everything to someone who could no longer receive it. The weight of that sacrifice pressed against Samuel's chest like a stone, making each breath a conscious effort. He understood now why she had written those words, not as a plea for pity, but as a simple statement of truth that needed to be spoken before it consumed her entirely. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but inside the ranch house, The air felt thick with unspoken grief. Samuel had buried his own wife 3 winters ago, had stood over her grave with dirt-stained hands and a heart that felt carved hollow. But this was different. This was watching innocence try to make sense of a world that had shown it nothing but cruelty, and somehow still finding the strength to protect what little remained. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't quite catch, and Samuel found himself leaning closer, as if her dreams might hold answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The child's face, even in sleep, carried a gravity that belonged to someone much older, someone who had learned too early that love sometimes meant going hungry so others could rest. The fire in the small hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell their own stories of loss and survival. Samuel had lit it not for warmth. The Kansas night was mild, but because something about the darkness felt too heavy for a child who had already carried more than her share. He watched the flames consume the dry wood with the same relentless hunger that had driven Emily to eat dirt, and wondered how many other children were out there right now, making impossible choices with the quiet heroism of the forgotten. The thought made his hands shake as he reached for the coffee pot, the metal cold against his palms despite the fire's warmth. This ranch house had once been filled with laughter and the sounds of a family building their dreams, but now it served as a sanctuary for the broken, a place where 2 wounded souls could sit in silence and begin to understand that survival sometimes looked like love. Samuel's eyes returned to the child's sleeping form, noting how even in rest she seemed to take up as little space as possible, as if apologizing for her very existence. Her clothes, patched and repatched with careful stitches, told the story of someone who had tried to make things last long past their natural end. The sight of those tiny, precise repairs done by hands too small for such work made Samuel's vision blur with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed since Martha's funeral. This child had learned to mend what was broken because no one else would do it for her, had become both mother and daughter to herself in a world that had forgotten she existed. The weight of that realization settled over Samuel like a heavy coat, warm and suffocating at the same time, as he began to understand that saving Emily might be the only way to save himself. The night stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story, full of possibilities that neither had dared to imagine. Samuel pulled his chair closer to Emily's makeshift bed, not to wake her, but to stand guard over dreams that deserved protection. In the morning, there would be decisions to make, words to speak, and a future to build from the ashes of what they had both lost. But for now, there was only this, a broken cowboy and a child who had eaten dirt for love, finding in each other's silence the first notes of a song that might eventually sound like home. Dawn crept across the Kansas plains like a cautious animal, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world that could let children starve. Samuel had not slept, had spent the night watching Emily's chest rise and fall with the desperate attention of a man counting his last coins. When she finally stirred, her eyes opened not with the confusion of waking in a strange place, but with the immediate alertness of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. She sat up slowly, her gaze moving from Samuel to the cold fireplace, to the sack that still lay open on the table, and in that sweep of her eyes he saw her cataloguing every detail, measuring every potential threat or blessing. The child who had written about eating dirt was also a child who had learned to read the world like a map of dangers, and Samuel felt his heart break a little more at the casual way she accepted this new reality. "You stayed," Emily said, and the words carried no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement that surprised Samuel with its lack of hope or disappointment. She spoke as if his presence was simply another fact to be noted and filed away, like the color of the morning sky or the sound of wind through broken shutters. Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady, and watched as she folded the horse blankets with the same careful precision she had used to write her confession. Every movement was economical, purposeful, as if she had learned that wasted motion was a luxury she couldn't afford. The sight of those small hands, smoothing wrinkles from fabric that would never be truly clean, made Samuel's throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Something between admiration and rage at a world that had taught a child such harsh efficiency. The morning light revealed details that darkness had hidden. The careful way Emily had arranged her few possessions in a neat pile. The fact that she had somehow cleaned her face and hands using water from the pitcher, Samuel hadn't even noticed her approach. She moved through the abandoned ranch house like a ghost who had learned to leave no trace, and Samuel realized that this child had spent so long being invisible that she had forgotten how to take up space. When she looked at him directly, her eyes held the same quality as the confession she had written, clear, honest, and devastating in their simplicity. She was waiting for him to tell her what came next, but without the desperate hope that might make disappointment unbearable. This was a child who had learned to expect nothing, and Samuel felt the weight of that expectation settle on his shoulders like a yoke he had never asked to carry but could never set down. "Are you hungry?" Samuel asked, and immediately regretted the question when he saw Emily's face close like a door slamming shut. Of course she was hungry. She had been hungry for so long that the sensation had probably become as familiar as breathing. But she shook her head with the automatic denial of someone who had learned that admitting need was dangerous, that wanting things only led to disappointment. Samuel watched her retreat into herself, saw the careful walls go up behind her eyes, and understood that feeding this child would require more than just offering food. It would mean teaching her that hunger was not a shameful secret to be hidden, that need was not a weakness to be denied. The realization made him feel clumsy and inadequate, like a man trying to perform surgery with hands meant for roping cattle. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words neither knew how to speak. Samuel found himself thinking of Martha, of how she had always known what to say to frightened animals, how her voice could gentle the wildest horse or calm the most skittish calf. But Emily was not an animal to be tamed. She was a child who had been forced to become her own protector, her own provider, her own source of comfort in a world that had offered her none. The thought of trying to undo that fierce self-reliance terrified Samuel more than any stampede or storm ever had. How do you teach someone to trust when trust had been the thing that hurt them most? How do you offer safety to someone who had learned that safety was an illusion that could be shattered without warning? Emily stood and walked to the window, her bare feet making no sound on the rough wooden floor. She pressed her face against the glass, looking out at the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched toward a horizon that seemed to promise nothing but more emptiness. Samuel watched her shoulders, saw the way she held herself as if preparing for a blow that might come from any direction, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not the breaking he had grown accustomed to, but a settling, like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their proper places. This child had written about eating dirt so her sister could sleep, had carried that burden alone until it had nearly crushed her, and now she stood at his window, looking out at a world that had given her every reason to despair, yet somehow she was still standing. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the abandoned ranch house in shades of gold and amber that made even the broken furniture look beautiful. Samuel rose from his chair, his joints protesting after the long night of watching, and moved to stand beside Emily at the window. Together, they looked out at the vast Kansas landscape, two people who had lost everything they thought they couldn't live without, and in that shared silence, Samuel felt the first stirring of something that might eventually grow into hope. The kitchen of the abandoned ranch house had not seen a proper meal in years, but Samuel moved through it with the careful attention of a man performing a sacred ritual. He had ridden to the nearest town at first light, leaving Emily with strict instructions to stay hidden, and returned with supplies that felt like promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Flour, sugar, eggs still warm from the hen, simple ingredients that transformed the dusty space into something that smelled like possibility. Emily watched from the doorway, her body poised for flight as Samuel's weathered hands worked the dough with surprising gentleness. He had learned to cook from Martha, who had insisted that a man should know how to feed himself and others. But he had never imagined that those lessons would become a way of speaking to a child who had forgotten the language of care. The biscuits that emerged from the old oven were golden and perfect, and when Samuel placed one on a chipped plate before Emily, he saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been wonder. She did not eat immediately, but held the warm biscuit in her hands as if it were made of something more precious than flour and butter. Samuel understood that this moment required patience, that rushing would shatter whatever fragile trust was beginning to form between them. He sat across from her at the scarred wooden table, his own breakfast untouched, and waited as Emily examined the food with the careful attention of someone who had learned that gifts often came with hidden costs. When she finally took her first bite, her eyes closed involuntarily, and Samuel saw tears leak from beneath her lashes. Not tears of sadness, but of relief so profound it seemed to shake her small frame. This was a child tasting safety for the first time, learning that food could be given freely, without expectation or condition, and the sight of that discovery made Samuel's own eyes burn with unshed emotion. "My sister loved biscuits," Emily whispered, and the words fell into the kitchen like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to touch every corner of the room. Samuel nodded, understanding that this was not just a memory being shared, but a gift being offered, the first real piece of herself that Emily had trusted him with. He could see her sister in his mind, a shadow child who existed now only in Emily's careful preservation of her memory, and he felt the weight of that responsibility settle over him like a mantle. This was not just about feeding one hungry child, but about honoring the love that had sustained them both through unimaginable hardship. The biscuit in Emily's hands became a communion, a way of including her sister in this moment of abundance, and Samuel felt privileged to witness such fierce loyalty. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of conversations that needed to happen and decisions that would shape whatever came next. Samuel had spent the ride to town thinking about practical matters, where Emily would sleep, how he would explain her presence to the neighbors, what legal steps might be required to make their arrangement official. But sitting here in the kitchen, watching this child eat with the careful reverence of someone who had known true hunger, he realized that the practical matters were secondary to something much more fundamental. Emily needed to learn that she deserved to take up space in the world, that her needs mattered, that love did not require her to make herself smaller or hungrier or less visible. The task ahead of them was not just about providing shelter and food, but about rebuilding a child's understanding of her own worth. Emily finished her biscuit and looked up at Samuel with eyes that held a question she didn't know how to ask. He saw in that gaze the same vulnerability that had marked her written confession, the desperate hope warring with learned caution that had become her default way of moving through the world. Samuel reached across the table and placed his hand over her small one, feeling the calluses that no 8-year-old should have, the scars that told stories of survival he would probably never fully understand. "You don't have to eat dirt anymore," he said quietly, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them like a promise that would take years to fully believe. Emily's fingers tightened under his, and for the first time since he had found her confession, Samuel saw something in her face that looked like the beginning of trust. The abandoned ranch house around them seemed to exhale, as if it too had been holding its breath, waiting to see if it would once again become a home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations, and Samuel felt something shift in his chest, not the familiar ache of loss, but the unfamiliar stirring of purpose. He had spent 3 years learning how to live with grief, but Emily was teaching him something different, how to live with hope. The child across from him had survived by eating dirt so her sister could sleep had written her confession with the stark honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. And now she sat in his kitchen learning that sometimes, miraculously, the world offered second chances to those brave enough to reach for them. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of seasons yet to come. Inside, a broken cowboy and a child who had known too much sorrow sat together at a table that had not seen such purpose in years, and began the slow, careful work of building something that might, eventually, look like family.